Before this album even came out, I was mesmerized by the singles that they were releasing for it. Especially the single, The Coma Machine. The moment it was released on YouTube, I kept hitting repeat over and over and over again. It finished, repeat. 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 I just couldn't stop. So the moment the full-length album was released, you were damn sure I was in the record store ready to pick this bad boy up. And now I can finally talk about it. I've been holding off reviewing this album for quite a while, only because I wanted to really digest the music. I really wanted to get a firm grip on it before I talked about it. So here we go. Coma Ecliptic by Between the Buried and Me. And Between the Buried and Me is one of the few bands that each album they bring out is better than the last. It surpasses it in both scope, music, ability, and concept. Each one was getting more and more ambitious, stretching further and further out of the norm. Starting off as a straight up technical death metal band, they've evolved into almost a progressive death metal band. And what I loved about this band is that they generally play in a major chord as opposed to a minor chord, which is usually found in that death metal. These boys prefer technicality over just that brutality that is so seen in these bands. As mentioned before, all of their albums have always surpassed the last one in terms of scope, concept, musicianship, and just overall atmosphere of the album. And this has actually brought us to almost their pinnacle of a monster of the album, the one they released previously, the Parallax Part 2 Future Sequence. It was so grand that the overture had to be an EP just to contain this thing. So the whole time, when I heard that they were going to release this album, I was thinking, how on earth are they going to surpass that beast of an album? And really, they did it by scaling back. They put a little bit more focus onto the musicianship and a lot less of a focus on being brutal the entire time. And did it work? Well, let's take a look first at the structure of the album, then the music in the album, and then finally the concept of the album. So first, in terms of structure, you'll notice that the songs are much shorter on this album. The longest song doesn't even touch the 10-minute mark. It's also not as relentless as past albums. It doesn't just keep going and going and going and knock you over the face. There are a number of pauses in this album, and even within the individual songs themselves, no song on here is just a relentless gush of music. There's a lot of time spent thinking about things. There's pauses to let the music sink in. Now that being said, there's still a logical progression in the songs. There's still that cohesive flow, this train of thought of narrative going on that blends all the songs together. If they don't transition seamlessly from one song to the other, they at least connect. And getting back to the individual songs on this album, the structures are very interesting. It's not quite a verse, chorus, but unlike previous albums where it just keeps going forward and never really looks back, these songs are structured in a way where there's at least some kind of a verse that keeps coming back in each of these songs. If not at least one, there's two or three where they're repeated over and over again. And I actually like these because those verses are so good. I always look forward to them coming back and being presented again. So moving forward to the music that's found on this album, as I said before, it is a lot less brutal than the previous albums. Now, of course, this is all in relativity because we still have some really brutal songs on this album. We still have the growls by Tommy Rogers really hitting you, but it's not as present. I'd say it's almost like a 30-70 split between growls and clean vocals. Clean being more on the 70 side and the growls being more on the 30 side. Now this is in contrast to a lot of their past albums where the split has always been more of like a 90% being growls and only 10% being clean. Now this forced Tommy to really stretch his limits in terms of presenting a really clean and a crisp vocals, and he does it very, very well. I'll give him props for really trying different things with the vocals and creating new characters on this album that I really enjoyed listening to. He mentioned that it was more of like a rock opera, and you can definitely hear that with the clean vocals. In terms of the driving force on this album, there's a step back from the two lead guitarists of Paul Wagner and Dusty Warning. To fill the gap, Tommy has come up with a lot of synth and keyboard sounds. In fact, each song has a really driving presence of a synth or a keyboard. As I had made reference before with those verses being repeated in the songs, they are stark different than the surrounding music around them within the song. And this creates a really nice, almost like a sandwich of a song, where you have these stark contrasts of brutality and then very melodic. And then you have very dark and guttural, very clean and crisp and clear. And these are all found within a very short period of time. So now let's take a look at the concept of this album. It's of an individual who is self-inducing a coma to themselves to either relive past lives or rediscover themselves in other bodies. And I will say that the story is much more easy to follow than the future sequence or the misdirect or colors, where like the future sequence, this is a full-on story, but unlike the future sequence, it's presented in a way that you can pretty much digest it in one go. You don't have to keep coming back and back and back to try to figure out what's going on. Because it is much more easy to digest, I found I enjoyed listening to this a lot more. So getting into some specific songs on here is actually kind of hard, as it works so perfectly as a whole album. Of course, The Coma Machine is still one of my favorite songs on this album, and one of my favorite songs that have been released this year. I still just keep hitting that refresh button and that back button whenever it comes on. I do need to call out Dim Ignition as having an overall Tangerine Dream feel to it. I love how, although we are being submerged into this new type of style, Between the Buried and Me are still able to retain their identity. The main beat and the driving force of the song is that synthesizer, and the band could have just left it as it is to keep that as driving force. But they still had Blake Richardson fill in that gap and really put in that Between the Buried and Me signature sound with his really great drumming.
His lightning bolt eyes creep through my side.
And I especially need to call out Famine Wolf for having one of their best guitar works we've seen on the band since About Colors. And of course, I really have to call out both the beginning and end of this album as being a perfect symmetry to one another. The beginning being very crisp, being very light, and being very beautiful. And the ending starting off being very light and very crisp and very beautiful, but ending on such a brutal note that it gets me very emotional. And if you can do that, you're doing your job right. There are also many moments on this album where I can hear other bands, and for one instance that I really need to call out, there's an instance on King Redeem, Queen Serene. It sounds very similar to the progressive rock artist Chris with his Days of Summer Gone. There's the title track on that album has the same note progression and the same underlying complexity of notes that when I first heard it, I'm like, hey, that sounds very much like this. And I wouldn't be surprised if Between the Buried and Me didn't hear that and try their own take on it, as both are very similar in their concept.
Taken from my time.
So all in all, I can see this album really splitting fans Between the Buried and Me. And I was worried when I was listening to this that a lot of their fans would retaliate against it for not being as brutal, for not being as intense. So I am loving the hell out of this album, and I will be listening to it for a very long time to come, as I have all their past albums. And as you can tell, I can pretty much talk endlessly about this album, but I'll cut it here. So at the moment, it is easily within the top 3 albums that have come out this year, and I'd be very, very surprised if anything better comes along. I would definitely pick this album up at your earliest convenience, no matter your musical tastes. If you can sit through a little bit of brutality and a little bit of those growl vocals, you will enjoy the hell out of this album. It may not be exactly what you expect, either approaching it brand new or being a lifelong fan, but I guarantee amazing music will follow. And that is it from Between the Buried and Me's Coma Ecliptic. What did you guys think? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Let me know, comment below. And of course, I gotta thank you guys for watching. I had a blast making this one, and so let me know what you guys really think. I love talking to you guys about this kind of music, and as I said, I can go on forever, so please let me know either on Twitter or in the comments below. I'm sure to respond. And that's it. Notes out.